Awesome. Thank you. Well, everyone, welcome to the June Adobe Marketo Engage Virtual North America User Group. It's a mouthful. We're so excited to have Jenn here with us today to talk about her experience with life cycles and kind of the gotchas that she's learned along the way. But before we get started, we'll go ahead and just run through some housekeeping slides and give everyone a few more minutes to join too. So just before we get started, just the user group house rules. Remember, no self-promotion or pitching of any kind is permitted. Please don't contact people without their consent. And then if anyone's sharing their use case, please don't share that information without their consent. And then just a note that the mug is being recorded. So be sure to, if there's anything you don't want said, wait till we go off of the recording at the end for questions. All right, and then you can stay connected with the North America mug. If you're new to the mug, be sure to sign up for alerts and to get all of the notices about our upcoming meetings at this link. And then there are upcoming opportunities just related to certification. If any of you need to get certified, there's these 3 different levels now. The new version of the MCE is now out. So that's definitely something you can look into. This page is great information for future exams. And all of the June mugs have already happened, we were saying as you guys were joining. So there's nothing for June yet, but definitely be sure to check out Bevy to see about all of the July opportunities. So with that, we'll go ahead and hand it over to Jenn. Those of you who don't know Jenn is a recently retired Marketo champion who was a champion for 6 years, which is amazing. A number of those years she spent in agency life, and she's seen just about everything, for better or worse. And she's super excited to share with us some things she's uncovered prior to moving back to the brand side in 2021. So Jenn, we'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right, thanks. Glad to be here and kind of share a lot of the basically learn from my mistakes sort of information. So if you can see my screen, we can go ahead and get started. So again, I'm Jenn DiMaria Keeler. Like Natalie said, I worked in agency for quite some time. So I've kind of seen the ins and outs of multiple instances who have tried to install a life cycle for better or for worse. So with that, I thought I would kind of start with my life cycle origin story, because life cycle was always kind of one of my weak spots. For whatever reason, I ended up in a bunch of companies along my journey where they either didn't care about life cycle, or they didn't have to care about the life cycle, or if they did care about the life cycle, they weren't necessarily tracking it in a way that they should, or they weren't running the types of reports that you would expect to see or that really made sense. So I picked up a lot of bad habits along the way. Luckily, however, I did end up at an agency where they kind of taught me the best practices. And I will say a lot of the agencies have this type of best practice. So it's not, just one person has this magical method. There are a lot of best practices that you can pick up. I happened to learn it at Digital Pie. There is a theory behind it and why it works, and we'll kind of go into that a little bit. But ultimately, I'm the type of person that has to learn by doing. So you can give me documentation, talk theory, ad nauseum with me, and I'm still not going to learn unless I actually break it myself. So that's where today really comes in, because everything that I've learned has come out of encountering and identifying process issues. And you'll find out that if you have the right, as we say, pipes installed, you'll be able to identify those leaks way more efficiently than if you were just kind of hobbling your way through. And something else that I learned is that if you have everything set up the way that it should be set up, nice and simple, you can use that to monitor other things that are going on as well. So for example, we just installed a whole new sourcing process here. And because of the way that that works, we're able to identify holes in that process. And just because we're monitoring sourcing doesn't mean that we're only monitoring sourcing, if that makes sense. So that's been really cool. And it's kind of the same thing with life cycle here. You'll see in my presentation that just because we're monitoring the life cycle doesn't mean that we can't identify other things that are going on. So I always thought that was kind of fun. So with that said, I thought we would take like a hot second to kind of talk about your life cycle story. And if you want to lob it in the chat, let us know like where you are in your life cycle journey from 1, I haven't implemented a life cycle yet, to 5, I've got a few life cycles under my belt. Maybe I've worked at a few companies. So just let us know where you are, and then hopefully we can address any questions that you have if you want to share anything. In the meantime, those of us who have seen a life cycle in the past have probably seen this beautiful funnel slide. It's very good at speaking to the overview of what a life cycle looks like. It's a nice funnel. You can see that a whole lot of people are coming in at the top and then they're spinning out at the bottom from awareness to customer. It usually correlates to stages like known, engaged, yada, yada, all those phrases and terms that we're familiar with. So it's really easy when you're talking about a life cycle to speak to it in terms of this type of funnel. However, the issue with this is that it assumes that everyone with a closed opportunity is going to flow through all those stages. And so what I mean by that is that if a record or an account becomes a customer, you might need to add some people to that account. Or if you have an opportunity, sales needs to add people to those opportunities. Those people are not necessarily flowing through the top of the funnel. So it makes your life cycle look a little bit more like this. So as you can see, it kind of replicates a funnel a little bit, but there are bits and pieces where it's going to ebb and flow a little bit differently. Right into where you get into the sales stages. And that makes sense because like I said, if sales converts an account to an opportunity, then they're probably going to be adding a few more people to that opportunity because they'll be working with multiple people through that. And then the same thing with customers. The other issue with the standard funnel version is that it doesn't take into account your detours. So for example, recycleds. People who are in the recycled bucket can pop back up to MQL or really any of the sales stages if sales wants to pick them out. So regardless, you're going to get maybe a little bit of bloat in those sales stages that the standard funnel doesn't account for. So that's just one sort of caveat that I wanted to bring up, because when you're talking to people about the life cycle, the first thing they'll usually do is bring up that funnel. And so you really have to educate them about like, this is good as like a visual, but when it comes down to reporting on the funnel and identifying where people need to be, it's going to not be nearly as perfect. And a lot of people get hung up on that. So it's just important to know. So where do you start when you inherit a life cycle and you need to just go to town? Well, the first thing I always say is brew a lot of coffee. I've already had 4 cups today, so I'm super wired and ready to attack your life cycle. This is really good for me because it just keeps me awake and I can focus and pay attention. So you're gonna need something. You're gonna need something. Then what I like to do is, even if documentation already exists, and if you're inheriting a life cycle, there's a good chance it does. I like to do my own, just because, like I said, I learn best from getting my hands dirty and stuff. So I will go through, I will audit a life cycle. I'll make my own documentation, whether it's flow charts or just noting stuff that I find interesting and kind of creating my own documentation around it, so I can see, you know, what's going on now and what do we need to consider in the future. And definitely asking questions and interviewing people about why things are happening is something that comes up a lot here. Ongoing maintenance is interesting because it's something that you need to think about upfront. As with anything in Marketo, I think a lot of people think that you can set it and forget it because it's an automation platform. But what people don't realize is that just because it's an automation platform doesn't mean that you don't have to go in there and keep feeding the dog, essentially. Like, you can't just let it starve to death because you put some stuff in there, you know? So you need to go in and make sure that A, you are doing ongoing maintenance, and B, that you set it up so that you can very easily do that. And then finally, some type of reporting. Make sure that you can even get to reporting to begin with, but then also that you're setting up your processes that you can pull things out. Like, for example, do you want to report on the specific SMART campaigns? Do you want to report on the actual stages? Do you want to report on the transitions between those stages? Identifying those things up front will help you set up your lifecycle processes to scale in the future. So, documentation and auditing. When I first get into an instance where I have to take a look at the life cycle, one of the first things that I'll look for is whether or not there's an active modeler. And not everyone will use a modeler, but at least in the beginning stages, if you're trying to figure out what's going on, this can be useful. And the reason that's useful is because it can really help you identify how people transition from stage to stage, as long as you have RCE. So that's one caveat. And the reason that I like to do that is because you can pull out reports that look like this. So for example, if I want to see how many people are transitioning to the MQL stage, I can see what other stages they're coming from, which is really cool because it can help you identify, is sales plucking leads out of engaged before they reach MQL? Like marketing might have an influence on those folks, but we didn't quite get them to the behavior stage yet, and we want to get some credit for that. But something else is that you can find some real wacky stuff. So for example here, when someone's in a sales stage, they shouldn't really be flowing back to an MQL stage. Like that's a little bit odd. And so you might want to investigate that. Like, did we have to fix some weird things that were going on in the life cycle? Is that why they changed? Is there a gap in processes? Was there a race condition somewhere that caused this? And then you can go and either decide if it's a big enough issue to fix and plug up those gaps, or if it's just something you can leave alone because it was a one-off, like random occurrence, things like that. So what I learned in a few circumstances when I had to go do this is that, at one company, our modeler was turned on, but the transition triggers hadn't been activated. And so the issue with that is that, unfortunately, the transitions don't retro. So we had lost an entire year of life cycle data to try and go and identify this stuff. And the way that works is if you take a look at your model in Marketo, you'll see all of your life cycle stages and purple arrows flowing between them. These arrows show which stages other stages can actually flow into. So for example, you're not necessarily going to go from engaged to customer right away necessarily. And it's broken out into your success path and then all of your detours. The way this works though is that you have to tell Marketo what qualifies for these little purple arrows. So you actually have to go into the modeler, double click on these guys and set your rules. What we were doing was we were manually changing it in the flow steps of each stage campaign, which is, totally fine. You can do it that way, but you have to tell Marketo in the little purple arrow that you're changing it in a flow step so that it can listen for that. If you don't do that, then these arrows aren't going to work, and you won't be able to get that stage transition data. You can kind of back into it if you're doing date stamps and things like that, but why do that when it's all right here for you, right? So fun little tip there. Learned a lot of things with that one. The next one that's really kind of a headache is misalignment. There is always a ton. And the two ways that I approached misalignment were, and the two most common things that I saw was, people are technically in the right stages, but those stages don't match across fields and statuses. So for example, let's take a look at our test lead, Josie Grossi. So here we have a custom field in Salesforce because as you know, if you have a revenue stage in Marketo, that doesn't necessarily translate to your sales team or any Salesforce reports that you have. So you need to create a custom field in Salesforce to write that Marketo data back down so other people can see it. So in this example, we have our custom CRM field that says that this lead is an MQL. Then our actual revenue stage in Marketo in that nice little modeler says that they're also MQL. However, their program status in the operational lifecycle program says that they're known. So that's a little bit weird. And I'm going to show you how I identified that and what that meant. So the name of my game is Massive Smart List. So I just created this gigantic smart list that looks for misalignment between any and all of that data. So for example, this first filter here is, the revenue stage is MQL, the RCM stage is MQL, but their program is not. And then I just kind of do different iterations of that between all of those fields and statuses until I have a giant list of like 32 different filters, depending on what I'm trying to do. It's a little bit of a pain to set up, but it really helps you identify where the misalignment is between all of those, specifically when it comes to program status. And then you can go into those records activity histories and see what happened. But I'll save you some time and let you know why that happened to us. A lot of times this happened because if you merge duplicates, they will potentially and almost always default to the winning records program status in the lifecycle program. So one record might be further along in the lifecycle, but the record that you defaulted to was maybe a known or engaged. Well, guess what? It's now going to move back through those stages. So we noticed a lot of that going on. Something else that happened was that our known, engaged, and MQL campaigns could trigger at the same time. So we had to add some extra constraints, some extra timing things to make sure that the data wasn't racing each other, especially when data was first coming into the system. When a record is created, their data is constantly changing because we're either backfilling data, we're auto-filling data with like form completes and things like that. And they're still browsing around the website, they're still doing stuff. So there's this whole slew of information coming in, and sometimes Marketo just can't keep up. So if you have all this stuff happening at the same time, one field might write to engaged, another one might write to known, and then yet another one might write to MQL. Like all this stuff is happening, and sometimes not in the right order. So something we did to combat this is, as you saw, there's the success path and the detours path. We actually created a third path just for when people are created that adds some extra processing filters and wait steps to make sure that only new people go through this specific flow. And it cut down on that misalignment by a crazy amount, especially when people were created as customers in the customer stage. They were added to accounts, but our lifecycle wasn't accounting for that, and they would get stuck in known when they should really be customers in the life cycle. So that really helped fix that issue. The second type of misalignment that I came across the most is when people meet the criteria for a stage, but for some reason they just haven't moved into it. So Josie Grossi is back. She has done an instant qualify activity. So in this scenario, 80 points is our instant qualify activity. She filled out a contact form, whatever. She should be an MQL. But if you take a look at the custom CRM stage, the revenue stage in Marketo, it says she's engaged, but the program status is engaged, but she should actually be in an MQL stage. So why isn't this information matching? Here's what I learned, so you don't have to go and investigate. A lot of times, people's statuses didn't populate correctly because Marketo was changing stages based on data that's not entirely populated. So this goes back to when a record first enters the system, the data is always changing. And that's why we created kind of that third path that people can follow when they're just created. And this ensured that this was a lot more accurate. You know, there are always going to be people that fall through the cracks, but at least you're not, you know, constantly playing whack-a-mole trying to fix the issue. You're going to get a bunch of people in there correctly if you do it that way. Another interesting thing that Marketo does inconsistently is that it doesn't always recognize that a data value has changed if a record is new. And what I mean by that is that if you input data into a field on a record, it won't always necessarily consider that data value change because technically no data is changing. There's no previous value, it was null. So most of the time it'll work just fine, but there have been instances in the past that I've identified where it doesn't. So if you're triggering off the data value change, just watch out for this and see if there's anything else that you need to implement into your logic to catch those. Something else that was really fun for us was that in our operational lifecycle program, we had the disqualified program status set to a higher step. So all of the lifecycle progression steps had the same number except for disqualified. So anytime someone DQ'd for whatever reason, they got stuck in DQ jail and they could never come out, even if they qualified, you know, became a valid record in the future. Even if sales started working on them in the future, we couldn't report on them because they were stuck in the DQ stage. So all we ended up doing there was just making sure all the stages were the same so people could pop in and out of the appropriate stage whenever they needed to. Complicated processes. So when you're dealing with a system where race conditions are a real headache, then it's important to make sure that your processes are as least complicated as you can make them because you want stuff to be firing as quickly as possible. So in this case, you want to think about, does the logic scale? Like, heaven forbid you need to add another stage to your life cycle. I recommend not having too many stages, by the way, but if you need to, there are a couple different models out there. So you might need to change something. You want to make sure that it scales. And then the other thing is, Marketo doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's really important that we know the other technologies that are feeding into the system. And something that I came across pretty frequently was that those systems were impacting the life cycle process in Marketo. I'll tell you what that means. So as far as the general complicated processes, we had a lot of filters in our smart campaign smart lists saying like, oh, if they meet this criteria, then exclude them from flowing through this campaign. And every now and then that would change. Like maybe we'd add a new competitor to our block list. Maybe we had an agency come in and we wanted to block them from going through. And every time we did that, we'd have to go into each and every single one of these campaigns and change that. So this is just 2 filters. There were others, but this is just an example of the type of filters that we wanted to put into all campaigns. So what we ended up doing instead was taking this information and putting it into a separate exclusion smart list. And then when those records were created, we just dumped them into an excluded stage in the life cycle. And what that does is when you go to filter on your triggers for each of your stage of smart campaigns, you can just say, look, they can only flow through this if they're coming from any of these specific stages and excluded. So just by default, you're excluding all of the records that you want to have excluded. And it just really simplifies it. You only have to edit filters in one place. It just helps you scale quite a bit. And it also saves some processing time. Like the less you need Marketo to think about things before it does them, then the better. And then going back to our fun little disqualified issue, the reason that was such a problem is because we identified that when someone unsubscribed from outreach sequences, they were automatically dequeuing. Like, I'm not sure when that logic was set up or who did it, but somehow when they unsubscribed, it was automatically mapping to our lifecycle status field and marking them as dequeued. And then as we know, they would get stuck there for the rest of our lives. So that was kind of a major issue, but we were able to fix it and retro those leads and get them out of that bucket. But definitely something to think about in terms of, it's not just Marketo monitoring like random processes that come in. There's all this other information that's feeding the system that you might need to be aware of. Then finally, you really got to keep the circus moving. Like, you can't just set it up and expect the monkeys to take care of themselves, right? So I created a bunch of smart lists that would just help me monitor what was going on. And as we know, massive smart lists are my game. So we talked earlier about when records are merged, sometimes their data is going to change, especially in the lifecycle program. But there's another fun little caveat to that. When you see the program status is empty, what can happen there and what happened to us is that people were getting deleted out of Salesforce only. And once they were getting deleted out of Salesforce, they were obviously getting removed from the lifecycle campaign that had a binary sync to the Marketo program. So they were then getting removed out of the Marketo program, but only living in Marketo because we only deleted it in one place. There's a whole lot of issues with that process. I bet you could all name at least like 2 or 3. But that is something to be aware of when you see like, oh, they have all their values filled except for the program status. So maybe a record got deleted somewhere. And it was always this issue when I looked into it. So in case you ever see something wacky like that, that's what we found. And so hopefully that'll save you some time. But again, gigantic smart list. So I created one called Lifecycle Merges, and all this does is it looks for a program status to be changed to anything other than known, but all of the other fields are known. And then I just kind of went through that and did that for all of the different stages, and it'll just pop out a list where it's possible that the reason that nothing matches is because they were merged. And then if it turns out to be another reason, cool, you investigated it, you know that it's misaligned, but just having this list and being able to figure out like what happened was really good for me to have, because people would ask questions and I would be able to answer them. There are endless questions when you're managing a life cycle, by the way. And then something else that happened is, that custom Salesforce field we chatted about. I've had issues with that changing to kind of whatever it wants to, whenever it wants to, and we needed to figure out why, because, you know, you can't run reports when data doesn't coordinate. So what we found out is that we all know one of Salesforce's best, and by best I mean worst, features is that it identifies leads and contacts and treats them as completely separate objects. So if you create this lifecycle field on leads, you also need to create it on contacts and make sure it's mapped. But even if and when you do that, there are still potentially going to be some issues where you might lose some data in there, especially if data changes as that's happening. So we found out that a lot of times this field was changing when leads were being converted to contacts and being added to opportunities, especially because we had some custom logic set up to write to an older value from when they were converted instead of whatever Marketo wanted to do. So it was kind of like Marketo and Salesforce were doing their own things, and a lot of time that would cause misalignment. But we were able to fix that, and so that wasn't a huge issue. We just needed to make sure that Marketo and Salesforce were talking and that everything was mapped correctly. But also, something else that can happen is that when a sync gets delayed, but data is different across both systems, that can impact the fields as well. So the Marketo sync happens 5 minutes after the last sync completes. But if you have a lot of stuff going on in your system, that can get delayed by 20, 30 minutes, even a day sometimes, depending on what's going on in there, or if you have a noisy neighbor on your pod, something like that. So you need to take that into account as well, because if Marketo has decided that, you know, this record is an MQL, but something happens over on Salesforce that says, you know, they're, you know, in a sales stage, then that Salesforce update is going to go back into Marketo before Marketo can make the update. And it's going to look like they skipped a stage there, if that's how you're tracking them. And then Marketo will have all of the other fields populated with a different value than what is actually their stage, which is what came in from Salesforce, if that makes sense. Again, our massive list, basically the same thing as the program one, except this time we're looking for a data value changed on your CRM field. And then it's set up the same way where that data value changed is not known, but everything else is known. And then you just go through one by one, looking all the different stages. And then this will let you know when that field is changing to something that it shouldn't be. And then you can work with your SOPs team to identify and fix that. Last but not least, this is probably actually the most important one, to be honest, is the types of reporting that you can pull out if you get this process functioning. And something that was a big deal to us was that MQLs were getting stuck. So we were able to use RCE to create this visual of, okay, here's the ending balance each month of our MQLs. How long have the MQLs been in our system, and kind of figure out, so that green line shouldn't be going up the way that it's doing. At the very least, it should be, you know, straight or ideally going down, but alas, it's not. And then also our ending balance keeps getting higher and higher and higher, like what's happening there. So we had to do some investigative work, and something that we uncovered was that we were really bad at maintaining our records in Salesforce. We had a bunch of users that weren't there anymore to receive their assignments, but lean data was still assigning records to them. And at the time, we didn't have monitoring in place to make sure that, you know, we were going in and checking those records, just because there were so many and, you know, limited time and resources, all of that stuff. So we really needed to go in there and fix that to make sure that we were assigning to only active users and that those people were actually getting alerts. The other super fun one that we had to work with SOPs on was that MQLs weren't able to sync to Salesforce because we had some fuzzy dupe criteria set up in there. So essentially, if Marketo tried to create a lead that had the same first and last name as literally anyone else in the world, then Salesforce wouldn't let them sync in. So we had a bunch of MQLs and other stages too, but you know, the MQLs were the worrisome ones where they would just get stuck in Marketo and nobody would know about them. So we had to work to remove that. We would rather have the dupes living in Salesforce than not know that they existed at all. And then let lean data or whatever take care of the rest. And then finally, MQL date fields is what we were using to identify MQLs versus the actual stage. And at one point, there was a situation where the MQL date fields were mapped to a different field on conversions. We were actually dropping off those MQLs in our reports, and it looked like they didn't actually MQL once they became a contact. So we needed to work with the sales operations team to make sure that, okay, we remap this, we retro it so that our reports don't look funny. And yeah, that goes back to the whole leads and contact objects that we all have grown to know and love, for better or worse. So with that, those are my key tips and tricks for playing around with your life cycle without losing your soul. I'm happy to chat with anyone who has questions.
I have a question. Hi, Jen. It's Courtney.
Oh, hey, how are you?
I joined a little late, so I apologize if you already talked about this, but what kind of time frame do you think is realistic, you know, as you have to obviously manage up and across the business of, they're like, oh, can you do it in 30 days?
So
realistic?
no, and I was gonna say, like, I kind of lucked out at my last company and actually here too, where they had all the criteria kind of laid out for me. They had those discussions. And even then, it would take at least 3 to 6 months probably to set this up and monitor it so that there aren't any gaps. Just because there is so much information feeding into it. And I know when I worked on client side, I would quote at least like, or when I was on agency side, I would quote at least like 80 hours.
Yeah, I was hoping you would say that time frame, because that's what I was thinking. And I guess I feel like the pushback is, what if we take everything else off your plate? Like, you don't have to do any webinars or emails and you can just do this. Can you then do it faster? And I feel like I want to say, no, it's not like I could do all 80 hours in 2 weeks. It really is a spread out time.
The build isn't the problem, right? It's those high-end conversations. So you need to get in with those stakeholders who want you to build it faster, and then they have to move on it. You know what I mean? So a lot of times, and like, that's totally fine. That's how it should be because it's catered to their business, but they need to be able to provide you with that information. So unless they're going to clear off all of their plates as well, then it's really hard to get things done faster when you're working on the build side of things.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Jen. I'm Brian, and I have a question about any tips that you have for backfilling statuses from a new life cycle, or from the old life cycle to the new life cycle, and just any problems you've run into, things to look out for and avoid.
I would say identify any processes that might kick off when you're doing that, because that's always a bear. But if it's going to be like a huge change with a ton of new values and there's a ton of data impacted, you might want to consider creating new fields for that, at least on the CRM side, just to make sure that nothing happens to kick anything off, especially on like the Salesforce side. I've seen a bunch of things happen there where we didn't account for some process that was written like 12 years ago. And like all of a sudden people are getting emails and it's like, why? Because we changed our status. Yeah, something like that. But I would say the biggest thing is to figure out like what's going to happen. Maybe run some tests, like change statuses on the records that you already have and just follow their activity logs to see what happens to them.
Hi, Jen, it's Sally. I have a question about those merges.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any practical way to deal with them once you identify it's the result of a merge?
Yeah, so you can, on your trigger for the stages, you can constrain by reason not contains merge. That works 90% of the time, but sometimes I've seen it where the record is merged, but Marketo doesn't identify that it's been merged yet, but it's still actually merging in the background. So you'll see all of the data changing and then it says that it merged. And so it was still able to trigger through that campaign because of the race condition. So you'll still get them here and there, but that's the most down and dirty way usually to at least try to fix it.
Hey, Jen, do you prefer it in all in Marketo or half in Marketo and Salesforce or other CRM?
I personally prefer it all in Marketo. I would say whatever you're doing, it needs to all be in one place or all in another, because otherwise, I mean, you have to pull in more stakeholders that way. You have to identify more trigger criteria that way. And then you can't change it yourself if that happens and you're waiting like 9 years for something basic, and then like it becomes a project that never ends and it's already an undertaking. So yeah, I would prefer it in one or the other, but not both.
Makes sense.
Awesome. Last call for questions.
I do have hi, sorry. I do have one
Oh, that's
question.
great.
I've noticed that sometimes, like you'd mentioned, that people don't necessarily go from one stage to the next in a linear fashion. But the program that I inherited, they assumed a lot of that. And so is there any reason really to check that they're in another stage, other than you don't want to take somebody out of opportunity when,
Right.
but it's those stages until they actually become opportunities, seems like you really don't want to prevent that.
Only if you really want to get into the granularity. So I've dealt with people who wanted to dive into that type of data specifically to see where like sales was poaching potentially marketing leads, like if you're dealing with like a marketing sourced type of situation when it comes to opportunities. So that's where that becomes important. I would say if it's not an issue yet and no one's talked to you about it, just maybe keep it in the back of your mind and, you know, plausible deniability.
Awesome. Well, if there aren't any other questions, we can go ahead and wrap up. Thank you.